Have you ever felt you were being used as bait without knowing? Or discovered someone had been living literally inside your house walls for months? These are real horror stories from people who escaped by chance or luck from situations that could have ended much worse. A pizza delivery driver sent to the back door of a house under police surveillance. A family that heard human breathing coming from inside their son's bedroom wall. Two friends who blinked and lost 5 hours of time in an empty field. Chris realized too late he'd been used to test police surveillance in an operation he didn't know existed. Mark pulled his children from the house seconds before an intruder living in the crawl space emerged from the corridor. Emily closed her eyes for an instant and woke alone at 3 a.m., without memory and without her friend. You have 15 seconds to understand that some situations put you in danger before you realize you're in the game, and the difference between escaping and not escaping is sometimes just a matter of timing. Chris Miller was 17 and worked at the town's most remote pizzeria, a place that attracted few customers but paid reasonably for a teenager without driver's license or relevant experience. Tuesday night shifts were especially slow, hours of boredom between occasional orders, cleaning already clean counters while pop music played too low to entertain but too loud to ignore completely. Manager Russell Kane had worked there 15 years, knew every regular customer by name, kept operation running through efficiency born of pure repetition. When phone rang at 8:45 p.m., Russell answered with automatic script. "Mario's Pizza. Can I take your order?" Pause while listening. Then his expression changed subtly. Not alarm, just focused attention that comes from unexpected information that he wrote down address, standard order of large pepperoni pizza, then added additional notes Chris saw while preparing box. Parking back. Cross yard. Knock ONOY on back door. Instructions were too specific to be casual, suggesting customer with particular reasons for avoiding main entrance or street visibility in this true home invasion story's beginning. "Outside our normal zone," Russell commented, "but it's slow night and he offered extra tip. Can you take it?" Chris grabbed keys to the pizzeria's Honda Civic, car shared between delivery drivers that permanently smelled like cheese and had sound system that only worked when it wanted. Address was 20 minutes driving, area Chris knew vaguely but had never explored after nightfall. Pizza came out of oven at 9:05 p.m. Chris packed it with professional care developed through hundreds of deliveries, checked he had enough change, and departed for trip that seemed routine despite peculiar instructions. During drive, his mind rationalized innocent explanations. Maybe customer had aggressive dog in front. Maybe was renovating main entrance. Maybe simply preferred privacy that back door provided. Area got progressively darker as he moved away from downtown commercial lights, entering sparse residential zone where houses stood distant from each other, separated by vacant lots and dense vegetation. Street lighting was minimal, forcing Chris to drive slowly to not miscorrect number on poorly lit mailboxes marking properties till he found the address. Single-story house with abandoned appearance despite recent order. No lights visible through windows that reflected darkness back. He parked behind as instructed, turning off engine that left uncommon silence filled only by crickets and distant dog barking. He grabbed still warm pizza and began crossing yard that instructions had mentioned. Yard was poorly maintained, tall grass brushing his calves as he walked toward dark house silhouette. Wooden fence leaned at unnatural angle, suggesting years of neglect or perhaps recent damage not repaired. Chris reached back door and knocked 3 times, sound echoing with emptiness suggesting unoccupied interior despite order placed minute ago. Nothing happened. He waited 30 seconds, knocked again harder, pressing it against door to hear movement inside. Still nothing. Then he noticed curtain in nearby window flutter slightly, not from wind since air was still, but internal movement suggesting someone watching from darkness without responding to knock at real intruder horror location. Chris's unease grew as curtains settled back into place, leaving him uncertain whether he'd actually seen movement or if shadows and nerves created illusion. He knocked 3rd time, calling out, "Pizza delivery for Jerry," using name Russell had written on order ticket. His voice sounded too loud in quiet neighborhood, breaking silence that felt deliberately maintained rather than naturally occurring. Then headlights cut through darkness from alley behind him. Not 1 vehicle but 2. Arriving simultaneously without sirens or visible markings, engines rumbling as they positioned to block his Civic's exit. Chris's heart rate spiked. Was this robbery set up? Had he been lured to isolated location for ambush using fake pizza order, a man emerged from first vehicle, plainclothes rather than uniform, moving with purpose that suggested authority despite casual appearance. He approached Chris with hand raised in gesture that could mean stop or calm down, expression serious but not threatening. "You the delivery driver?" Voice carried practice calm of someone accustomed to managing tense situations. "Yes, sir. I have pizza for Jerry at this address." Chris held up thermal bag like shield. Pizza's warmth suddenly feeling absurd given situation strangeness. Man pulled badge from belt, showing identification too quickly for Chris to read details, but long enough to establish legitimacy. "Detective Avery Cole, I need you to return to your vehicle now. Don't ask questions, just go." More figures emerged from darkness, uniformed officers moving to surround house from multiple angles. Coordinated approach suggesting planned operation rather than response to emergency call. They communicated through hand signals and whispered radio transmissions. Professional efficiency that excluded Chris from their tactical considerations while using his presence as triggering element. "The pizza order?" Chris asked, confusion overriding survival instinct to simply obey and leave. Detective Cole took thermal bag from his hands, checking receipt stapled to top. "Jerry, right? What number called it in?" Chris recited phone number from memory, digits Russell had written on order ticket. Cole nodded to officer who immediately began tracing call through radio to dispatch. "This address is under surveillance." Cole explained in tone suggesting this was more information than Chris should receive, but situation required minimal explanation. "Someone inside made that call. We need to know if it was target or someone else. You can go now, but we'll need statement later if this develops into arrest situation." Chris backed toward Civic, movements careful to avoid sudden gestures that might trigger armed officers' defensive responses. He climbed into driver's seat, started engine with shaking hands, and pulled away slowly while checking rearview mirror obsessively. Behind him, officers converged on house with practiced precision, some covering exits while others approached back door he'd been knocking on minutes earlier. The drive back to Pizzeria felt longer than outbound trip, adrenaline creating temporal distortion where each minute stretched into several. Chris's mind raced through implications of what he'd stumbled into. Police stakeout, someone in house under surveillance, pizza order that might have been test or signal, or desperate attempt at normalcy from someone unaware they were being watched. Russell was closing when Chris returned, expression shifting from mild concern about extended delivery time to alarm when he saw Chris's shaken appearance. "What happened? You okay?" Chris explained encounter in fragments, words tumbling over each other as delayed shock manifested through verbal processing of experience that hadn't fully settled into coherent narrative. Russell listened without interruption, face going through expressions that matched Chris's own delayed understanding of situation's potential danger. When Chris finished, Russell was silent for a moment before speaking carefully. "You realize what could have happened if those cops weren't there? If someone inside answered that door?" The question crystallized fear Chris had been avoiding during drive back. He'd been sent to isolated house under police surveillance, instructed to approach back entrance where visibility was minimal and escape routes were limited. The specific instructions, park behind, cross yard, knock only on back door, took on sinister dimension when considered as tactical positioning rather than customer preference. "I was bait," Chris said slowly, realization forming as he spoke words aloud. Someone in that house ordered pizza to see if police were watching. If delivery went normally, it meant coast was clear, but if police intervened. He didn't finish sentence, implications too disturbing to voice completely. Russell nodded grimly. Or whoever's in there is so paranoid they are testing every interaction, seeing if cops react to normal activity. Either way, you got used as probe to measure surveillance perimeter. That's not random customer behavior. That's someone who knows they are being watched and is trying to map the response. Chris felt violated by this understanding. His routine delivery transformed into unwitting participation in operation he hadn't consented to join. Neither police nor criminal had considered his safety beyond tactical utility, both sides using him as game piece in confrontation where his vulnerability served as strategic needs. "Did they pay?" Chris asked absurdly, knowing answer didn't matter but needing to anchor conversation in transactional normalcy. Russell check register. Credit card pre-authorized but charge never processed since delivery wasn't completed. Number will probably trace the burner or stolen card anyway. The phone number used for order became focus of Chris's obsessive speculation during following days. He searched it online, found no matches. He drove past the house during daylight, seeing it looked inhabited but unremarkable. No evidence of police presence or dramatic arrest. Local news reported nothing about operational stakeout in that area. Detective Cole never contacted him for statement, suggesting operation either resolved without arrest or was ongoing with his involvement deemed too minor to require follow-up. Chris was left with questions that would never be answered. Who was Jerry? What was police investigating? Had his delivery attempt helped or hindered whatever outcome eventually occurred? The experience changed how he approached deliveries, especially unusual ones with specific instructions or unfamiliar addresses in isolated areas. He began questioning orders that felt wrong, trusting instinct over customer service training when situations triggered alarm responses that 17-year-old brain had previously dismissed as paranoia or social awkwardness. Russell implemented new policy: no deliveries to addresses outside standard zone without manager approval, and absolutely no deliveries with instructions requiring approach through back entrances or non-standard access points. Not worth the liability, he explained to Chris. You're a delivery driver, not tactical asset. If cops or criminals want to use someone as test subject, they can hire professionals who sign up for that risk. But policy couldn't erase knowledge that Chris had gained, that ordinary activities could become components of operations beyond his awareness, that pizza order could be tactical probe, that knocking on strangers' door in darkness could place him between police and suspect without his consent or understanding of danger he was entering. Mark Ellis had inherited Beach House from father who had passed suddenly from heart attack, leaving property that held childhood summer memories now complicated by adult responsibilities of ownership and maintenance. At 40, Mark had his own family, wife Rachel, son Jordan, 7, and Scott, 5, who transformed house from memorial to living space through week-long vacation that connected generations through shared location. Wednesday evening around 9:30 p.m., family was winding down after beach day that had exhausted children through hours of wave jumping and sandcastle engineering. Scott was already asleep in smaller bedroom, his breathing audible through monitor Rachel kept plugged in despite Mark's argument that 7 and 5-year-olds didn't need constant audio surveillance. Jordan was in bed but not asleep, reading light creating warm glow under his door that indicated he was sneaking extra pages of chapter book before accepting sleep's inevitability. Mark was heading to shower when Jordan's voice called from room. "Dad, there's scratching in my wall." Mark paused, recognizing requests for investigation a parental role demanded despite fatigue and desire for adult relaxation time. Beach houses had mice, squirrels, raccoons, wildlife that found ways into wall spaces and created nocturnal disturbances that alarmed children but rarely required emergency response. Probably just a mouse. "Buddy, they can't get into your room." "It sounds big," Jordan insisted, voice carrying edge that moved concern from routine to legitimate. Mark entered room, sitting on bed's edge while Jordan pointed to wall behind headboard. "There, listen." They both went silent, Mark pressing ear against drywall cool from ocean breeze flowing through open window. At first nothing, then he heard it. Rhythmic scratching like fingernails dragging across surface, but from inside wall cavity where sound shouldn't originate unless something was indeed trapped between studs. The rhythm was wrong for animal, too deliberate, too sustained, almost methodical in its repetition, creating pattern that suggested intention rather than panic movement. Mark stood, trying to track sound's location through wall length. It moved, following his position from inside wall cavity as if whatever produced it was tracking his shadow through drywall. The scratching intensified when he stopped moving, becoming almost frantic, then settling into slower rhythm when he resumed motion along wall. "Jordan, go to Mom in living room," Mark said quietly, trying to maintain calm while adrenaline spiked recognition that this wasn't wildlife behavior. Jordan read father's tone accurately, climbing from bed without argument, and leaving room with backward glance that showed he understood something was wrong beyond explanation Mark was willing to share. Mark pressed ear against wall again, listening with focus that elevated every sound to threatening potential. The scratching had stopped. In its place came something worse. Breathing. Slow, deliberate inhalation and exhalation that carried through drywall with clarity, suggesting proximity measured in inches rather than feet. Human breathing, unmistakable in its rhythm and depth, coming from space that should contain only insulation and wooden framework supporting Beach House's aging structure. The breathing continued, steady and loud enough to eliminate any remaining doubt about its source. Mark's hand trembled against wall, A primitive fear response triggering despite rational mind's attempt to construct innocent explanations. Maybe contractor left radio in wall during renovation. Maybe sound carried from neighboring property through acoustic peculiarity. Maybe he was experiencing auditory hallucination from stress and exhaustion. Then voice came through wall, guttural and raw. Get out. Not shouted but growled. Sound more animal than human despite obviously originating from human vocal cords. The words reverberated through drywall, vibrating against Mark's palm pressed flat where breathing had been. Confirmation that living person occupied space that architectural plans insisted was empty wall cavity. Mark stumbled backward, rational thought collapsing into pure survival response. He ran from Jordan's room toward living area where Rachel sat with both boys, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm as she processed Mark's face. Someone's in the walls, he said, words sounding absurd even as he spoke them. In Jordan's room, between the studs, there's a fucking person in there. Rachel's skepticism lasted only until she saw he was serious, until his shaking hands and pale complexion communicated that whatever he'd experienced had overcome his usual calm during household emergencies. She grabbed phone, dialing 911 while Mark gathered both boys, lifting Scott from couch where he'd been relocated, gripping Jordan's hand tight enough to make his son wince. Behind them, sound of movement came from hallway, not from within walls now but from physical space, footsteps emerging from direction of Jordan's room. Mark toned, seeing figure emerge from corridor into living room's light, and his mind struggled to process what eyes reported. A man, or something that had once been man, stood in hallway entrance. He was covered in filth, clothes barely recognizable under layers of grime, hair matted into dreadlocks that suggested months without washing. But most disturbing was expression, rage mixed with territorial possession. Face contorted into snarl that showed yellow teeth while eyes remained focused on Mark with predatory intensity that communicated threat beyond mere intrusion. This is MY House, the figure said, voice same guttural growl that had come through Jordan's wall. You're in MY House. He took step forward, movement triggering Mark's protective response. He pushed Rachel and boys toward deck's sliding door, fumbling with lock while keeping eyes on approaching intruder who moved with deliberate slowness suggesting confidence rather than caution. The door opened, family spilling onto wooden deck that overlooked beach where moonlight created silver path across dark water. Mark slammed door closed behind them, engaging lock that provided psychological barrier despite knowing glass could be shattered with single chair impact. They huddled against deck railing. Scott crying now, Jordan silent with shock. Rachel still on phone with 911 dispatcher providing address and situation summary. Through glass, intruder pressed against door, hands leaving brown smears on surface as he pounded glass with fists that should break material but somehow didn't despite violence of impacts. His mouth moved, forming words they couldn't hear through barrier, tongue dragging across glass in gesture that combined threat with possession claim, marking territory through saliva and rage. Police are 3 minutes out, Rachel reported, voice steady despite trembling hands gripping phone. They said stay outside, don't engage. They are sending multiple units. 3 minutes felt infinite while watching figure continue assault on glass, his fury intensifying rather than diminishing, creating sustained performance of rage that suggested mental state beyond rational calculation. Then sirens approached, sound carrying across water and through residential streets with promise of authority and intervention. Intruder's head turned toward sound, expression shifting from rage to calculation. He disappeared from door, footsteps receding into house's interior, leaving family on deck uncertain whether he'd fled or made it repositioned. 4 officers arrived simultaneously, 2 approaching front entrance while 2 moved to beachside deck where family waited. Rachel opened sliding door for officers who entered with weapons drawn, clearing rooms with practiced efficiency while Mark provided information about intruder's appearance and last known position. Within minutes, they located him attempting exit through bathroom window, subduing him with minimal force that suggested his resistance was more theatrical than genuine. Detective Lang arrived 20 minutes later, after initial securing of scene and intruder's transport to patrol car. He was older, carrying authority that came from decades of investigation experience, and he approached family with sympathy that acknowledged trauma while needing to gather information efficiently. He's been living here, Lang explained after brief consultation with officers who'd cleared house, probably for months based on the nest we found. Nest? Rachel repeated, voice flat with disbelief. Lang gestured toward house interior. Mind if I show you? It'll help you understand what you're dealing with for insurance and security purposes. Mark followed while Rachel stayed with boys who were finally settling into exhausted calm that adrenaline crash brought after sustained terror. Lang led Mark to house's perimeter, pointing to crawl space access under front porch that Mark had never noticed despite years of childhood summer spent here and recent week of occupancy. This access was supposed to be sealed. Lang explained, pulling aside plywood that moved freely on hinges that someone had installed. Your intruder opened it, created entry point to crawl space that runs under entire house foundation. They crawled into space together, Lang's flashlight revealing area maybe 2 feet high, dirt floor, exposed plumbing and electrical that provided mechanical life support to structure above. But approximately halfway toward house center, a pile of belongings showed where intruder had created living space, sleeping bag, food wrappers, empty water bottles, and disturbing additions like photographs taken through house windows showing family during daily activities. He's been watching you all week, Lang said quietly. These photos are dated with phone timestamps going back to Sunday when you arrived. He knew your routines, when kids went to bed, when you'd be in specific rooms. The violation of privacy elevated beyond physical intrusion into psychological warfare. Knowledge that stranger had studied their vulnerable moments through lens suggesting obsessive focus on family that had unknowingly invaded what he considered his territory. But worse discovery came when Lang pointed flashlight upward, showing opening in crawl space ceiling that had been cut into floor joists. This goes up into wall cavity between first floor and foundation. From here he could access interior wall spaces throughout house. He pulled himself through opening, Mark following despite claustrophobia and disgust, emerging into vertical shaft between wall studs exactly as Mark had suspected from Jordan's room. The shaft was narrow but navigable for thin person willing to endure discomfort, vertical passage that connected crawl space below to wall cavities throughout house. Lang's light revealed markings on studs showing where intruder had climbed repeatedly, wearing grooves into it through sustained use over extended period. From here he could hear conversations, watch through electrical outlets he'd modified, even access rooms when you were asleep or away. They climbed back down, emerging into crawl space that now felt malevolent rather than merely unpleasant. But Lang had one more discovery. There's interior access too. He led Mark to Jordan's closet, where clothes hanging against back wall concealed panel that appeared structural but actually moved when pressed. The panel opened into wall cavity they just explored from below, showing how intruder could emerge directly into bedroom when family was occupied elsewhere. The intruder identified himself as Caleb Dorsey during booking, providing information reluctantly through paranoid filter that characterized all his interactions with authority. His confession came in fragments during detectives' interview, recorded statement that Mark reviewed later through police reports that became part of insurance claim and legal documentation of experience. Caleb claimed he'd been living in Beach House for 3 months, entering when property sat vacant between rentals during off-season. He'd discovered unlocked crawl space access during previous visit years ago when he considered property for rental but couldn't afford deposit. When he'd returned desperate for shelter during recent homelessness crisis, he'd remembered that access and broken outdated lock with crowbar. Initially, he planned to stay only nights, leaving during days to avoid detection by neighbors or property managers. But as weeks passed without disturbance, he'd grown bolder, expanding living area and creating comfort features that suggested intention for permanent occupation. He'd tapped into house's water lines and electrical, rigging connections that bypass meters to avoid detection through utility usage spikes. The interior wall access had been calculated improvement, cutting through floor joists and creating vertical passages that allowed him to monitor property for threats while enjoying perverse intimacy with occupants when house was eventually rented. He described watching previous short-term renters, learning their patterns, feeling sense of ownership over space he'd occupied before their arrival. Mark's family arrival had triggered territorial response rather than self-preservation flight. This was my place, Caleb insisted during interview. I'd been there months. They were invading MY home, sleeping in MY space. I had more right to be there than they did. The delusion was complete, supported by extended occupancy that had allowed him to develop possessive attachment transcending legal ownership. His plan, according to confession, had been to frighten family into leaving through progressive intimidation, noises and walls, occasional appearances, creating atmosphere of haunting that would make continued vacation unpleasant enough to trigger early departure. Then he'd reclaim property until next rental arrival required renewed territorial defense. The family abandoned remaining vacation days, returning home immediately after giving statements and collecting belongings under police supervision. Mark hired contractors to seal all external access points, install interior wall reinforcements that prevented future cavity access, and upgrade security beyond standard beach house precautions that had proven inadequate against determined intrusion. But physical repairs couldn't address psychological damage. Jordan developed sleep disturbances requiring nightlight and parental presence, his trust in bedroom safety destroyed by knowledge that someone had been literally inside his walls, listening to dreams and breathing through barrier measured in drywall inches. Scott was too young to fully process experience, but his attachment behaviors intensified, requiring constant physical contact with parents that suggested pre-verbal trauma response. Mark and Rachel's relationship with Beach House changed fundamentally. Property that had represented generational continuity and positive childhood memories became crime scene, space contaminated by knowledge that stranger had occupied it more recently than legitimate family ownership. They considered selling but couldn't stomach idea of another family experiencing similar violation without warning that felt legally and morally necessary but would destroy property value. They returned following summer, 4 years after incident, bringing children back to location that had traumatized them in effort to reclaim space through positive experiences. The house had been modified extensively, new access barriers, security cameras, alarm systems sensitive enough to detect mouse but reliable enough to avoid false positives that would create sustained anxiety. But fear residue remained. Mark checked crawl space access daily despite knowing it was now welded shut. Rachel avoided leaving children alone in any room, hypervigilant about separation that wasn't healthy but felt necessary. Jordan refused to sleep in his old bedroom despite new construction that should have eliminated any possibility of wall cavity occupation. The experience taught brutal lesson about home security that traditional real estate advice never mentions. Physical structure is only protection layer, and determined intruders will find ways around standard barriers if motivated by delusion, desperation, or simple criminal opportunism that treats occupied spaces as available resources waiting for exploitation. Emily Carter and Taylor Reed had been best friends since middle school, relationship forged through shared outsider status in small rural town where social hierarchies calcified early and remained resistant to change. At 16, they developed ritual of nighttime bike rides to field beyond town limits where light pollution diminished enough to see stars with clarity impossible near residential areas. This particular Friday night, they'd pedal familiar route with cheap wine stolen from Taylor's older brother's stash, giggling about minor transgression while navigating poorly maintained road by moonlight and occasional headlamp glimpses that caught potholes before impact. The field lay 2 miles from last house, corn having been harvested weeks earlier, leaving stubble and bare earth that stretched to tree line distant enough to create horizon illusion. They spread blanket that Taylor carried in backpack, lying on backs with wine bottle passed between them while conversation drifted through topics that felt profound in darkness and alcohol but would seem mundane in daylight sobriety. Above them, stars populated sky in density that urban dwellers never experienced, Milky Way visible as cloudy bands suggesting billions of suns beyond human comprehension. "Make a wish," Emily said when meteors streaked across field of vision, bright enough to cast momentary shadows on ground around them. Taylor obliged with closed eyes and whispered hope she wouldn't share, superstition holding that voice wishes lost power through verbalization. Emily closed her own eyes, feeling wind against face, sensation of earth rotating beneath them creating vertigo that wine amplified. The moment stretched, peaceful and infinite, suspension of normal time that comes from being young and outside social surveillance, enjoying freedom measured in stolen hours and parent-free spaces where identity could be explored without judgment or consequence. Emily felt herself drifting towards sleep or meditation, consciousness softening into state where boundaries between self and environment became permeable. She opened eyes, intending to comment on wind's increase or suggest they start heading home before parents noticed absence. But field was different, wrong in ways her brain struggled to process. Taylor was gone, not moved to different position, not visible in middle distance where she might have wandered while Emily zoned out, just absent as if she'd never been there. Taylor's bike was also missing. Both bike and rider vanished without sound or disturbance that should have woken Emily if she'd actually been sleeping. The blanket felt cold beneath her, suggesting extended time passage, but sky looked similar, moon in approximately correct position for time that should have elapsed. Emily sat up, calling Taylor's name into darkness that absorbed sound without echo, feels swallowing her voice like ocean absorbs raindrops. Emily pulled phone from pocket with hands that had started trembling from cold that seemed to have arrived instantly, temperature drop suggesting weather shift during unconscious period. The screen's glow-hurt eyes adjusted to darkness, displaying time that made no sense. 3 a.m. They'd arrived at field around 11 p.m. She'd closed eyes for what felt like seconds, and now 4 hours had passed without memory or awareness of their passage. She stood unsteadily, spinning in circle while calling Taylor's name louder, shouting now rather than speaking, creating noise that should attract attention if a friend was within reasonable distance. Nothing responded except wind that had increased to sustained pressure rather than occasional gusts, pushing against her body like invisible hands urging return to town. Phone showed no missed calls, no texts, no indication that Taylor had tried contacting her during mysteriously elapsed hours. Emily's call log showed only outbound attempt from earlier in day, nothing incoming since they'd left town together on bikes that were now selectively missing. Emily's remained where she dropped it at Blanket's edge, but Taylor's was gone along with Taylor herself. Emily tried calling Taylor's number, holding breath while ringtones sounded once, twice, 3 times before going to voicemail that captured Taylor's voice from when they recorded greeting together, laughing and competing for microphone space. Emily left desperate message. "Where are you? What happened? I woke up and you're gone and it's 3 a.m. and I don't understand. Call me back, please." She tried several more times, each attempt going straight to voicemail suggesting phone was off or dead, battery drained during missing hours that Emily couldn't account for. She considered calling parents, but couldn't construct explanation that wouldn't result in grounding or was. Couldn't admit they'd been drinking in field beyond town limits where cell reception was unreliable and help would take 30 minutes to arrive. The feel felt wrong now, oppressive in a way it hadn't before whatever had happened. Emily grabbed her bike and Taylor's blanket, pedaling back toward town with speed that made nighttime obstacles dangerous, risking accident through prioritization of distance over caution. The ride that had felt peaceful hours earlier became terrifying, every shadow suggesting threat, every sound potentially predatory. She reached town limits at 3:40 a.m. according to phone that had become obsession, checking it every few minutes as if time display might suddenly correct itself and reveal that hours you remembered were real rather than missing. Streets were empty as they should be at this hour, houses dark except for occasional porch light left on for teenagers who promised to be home by midnight. Emily went directly to Taylor's house, throwing pebbles at bedroom window in tradition established through years of late-night communications and after-curfew adventures. No response. More pebbles, harder throws that made noise which would wake Taylor as she was home, which should also wake parents and create consequences Emily was prepared to accept for relief of finding friends safe. Taylor's mother appeared at door eventually, confused and increasingly alarmed as Emily tried explaining that Taylor was missing, that they'd been together in field and now Taylor was gone. Mrs. Reed checked Taylor's room, finding her sleeping soundly in bed where she'd apparently been all night. No evidence of field trip or bicycle ride or missing hours that Emily insisted they'd shared. Emily's insistence that Taylor had been in field contradicted physical evidence of Taylor in bed, creating confusion that couldn't be resolved through simple explanation of misunderstanding or miscommunication. Mrs. Reed's growing concern about Emily's state, disheveled appearance, alcohol smell, agitated manner, resulted in call to Emily's parent who arrived to collect their daughter while apologizing for disturbance. Emily spent night in her own room, unable to sleep despite exhaustion, cycling through memories of evening that felt real but apparently weren't shared by only other person who should have experienced them. She checked phone obsessively for messages from Taylor, finding none despite leaving multiple increasingly frantic voicemails that Taylor should have received if phone was operational. Morning came without resolution, Emily finally falling asleep near dawn from sheer exhaustion. She woke at noon to missed call from Taylor and texts that made reality feel even more unstable. Are you okay? My mom said you showed up at like 4 a.m. saying I was missing. I woke up at 3 in the field and you were gone. I called you like 10 times, but it went straight to voicemail. What happened? Emily read message 3 times, each reading failing to make it make sense. She checked her call log. No incoming attempt from Taylor. No missed calls during hours she'd been panicking and pedaling home alone. She called Taylor immediately. Conversation that followed creating more confusion than clarity. I woke up and you were gone, Taylor insisted, voice carrying same confused desperation that Emily felt. One second you were next to me. I closed my eyes to make wish on meteor, opened them and you'd vanished. Your bike was gone. Blanket was cold. I freaked out and tried calling, but your phone was off or dead or something. They compared timelines, discovering both claimed to have woken at 3 a.m. Both claimed the other had vanished. Both claimed to have tried calling without success. Neither had memory of anything between closing eyes around 11:30 p.m. and opening them nearly 4 hours later to find themselves alone in field that suddenly felt threatening rather than peaceful. Maybe we both fell asleep and dreamed the other disappeared. Taylor suggested, grasping for rational explanation that could contain experience within normal parameters of shared alcohol consumption and fatigue. But neither had memory of sleeping. Both insisted they'd only closed eyes for a moment that somehow stretched into hours without conscious experience of time passing. They returned to field together the next day in daylight, searching for evidence that might explain missing hours or support one version of events over another. The blanket was gone. Emily had taken it home, but Taylor claimed she'd also taken blanket home, creating paradox of two blankets where only one had existed. They found nothing else. No disturbance in date, no bicycle tracks beyond what they were currently creating, no indication that anything unusual had occurred in space that felt ordinary and unthreatening under afternoon sun. Neither could explain cold log discrepancies. Emily's phone showed multiple outgoing attempts to Taylor with no incoming. Taylor's showed reverse pattern. Technical support at phone company couldn't explain how logs would diverge when both devices operated on same network in same geographic area during same time period. They abandoned habit of nighttime field visits after that night, finding new locations in daylight hours for hanging out that felt safer through visibility and witness availability. But trust and continuity of experience had been shaken, recognition that consciousness might not be as reliable as they'd assumed, that hour could apparently vanish without memory while leaving them in slightly different versions of reality than they'd started in. Emily ended her account with admission that she'd never understand what happened in that field, that trying to impose rational explanation on inherently inexplicable experience was exercise in frustration. Some mysteries don't have solutions. Some experiences transcend current understanding of physics and consciousness, and sometimes closest friends can share evening that diverges into separate timelines without warning or explanation that satisfies scientific methodology or common sense expectations about reality's consistency.